Hello and welcome to Teenagers Untangled, the audio hug for parents going through the teenage years. I'm Rachel Richards, parenting coach, journalist, mother of 2 teenagers and 2 bonus daughters. Now, poor behaviour in schools has made regular news headlines in the UK, where a BBC survey found nearly 1 in 5 teachers in England has been hit by a pupil this year. But it's not just here. In Australia, stricter school discipline is making a comeback to classrooms in a bid to help teachers stamp out disruptive behaviour. France is bringing back school uniforms to tackle the issue. And in America, more than 70% of 1,000 educators said in a recent national survey, students are misbehaving more now than they did before the pandemic. Well, it's a complex issue that needs much more than this one episode, but I thought it would be great to talk with Simon Currigan, who has a podcast called School Behaviour Secrets. He's a dad to teenagers and he has a website called Beacon School Support with courses for teachers on how to manage difficult behaviour. This episode is unusually long, but I genuinely found this conversation with Simon deeply enlightening. He gives us some useful tips on how to deal with a teen when they've lost control, the importance of asking why at least 5 times, and a framework for understanding school avoidance. I started by asking what he thinks is going on with bad behaviour in schools.
What we're seeing, particularly since COVID, and I still work day in, day out with schools across the Midlands, what we're seeing is increasing numbers of children presenting higher and higher needs. And the funding isn't there from the local authority to give the school the support they need to meet those needs. Essentially, money translates into manpower. And manpower translates into relationships with kids and adaptations and support in school. And essentially, the wheels are coming off the system. So you've got teachers who have more and more children who are presenting difficult, higher levels of need, which results, when those needs aren't met, it results in more difficult behaviour in the classroom because the kids are overwhelmed and they can't cope. The teachers are getting stressed. They don't have the training and support they need to support the kids. The parents are getting stressed and frustrated because they can see their children's time is being wasted. You know, whether it's your child who has those needs or whether you're a parent of a child in class where the learning is being disrupted. It's just this really difficult situation. And that doesn't mean that teachers don't care and that schools don't care. But actually, there are systemic problems with the education system right now, which is why more and more teachers are leaving. And
I know that you used to be a teacher and then you ended up dealing with special needs students, and now you've moved into this area. Can you give us a little bit of an understanding of the difference between SEMH and SEND? Because people who are parents, either they're in the thick of this and they've had to learn all these acronyms and learn what all this stuff means because they've got a child who has needs, or you're a parent whose kid is in a class with one of these kids and you have absolutely no idea what the challenges are or what's being done.
Yeah, absolutely. And the problem with teaching, like a lot of other organisations, it's really jargon heavy. But actually, the distinction is really super simple. So SEMH is a kind of SEND, and I'll just unpick what that means a little bit. SEND stands for Special Educational Needs and Disabilities, which means any child who has a specific additional need in any area. So that could encompass reading. It could encompass social skills. It could encompass someone who's got a physical disability that makes it difficult for them to, say, go upstairs or need some accommodation in terms of seating. It could include dyslexia or dyscalculia. There's this whole range of needs. Now, SEMH stands for Social, Emotional and Mental Health Needs, and it's one subset of SEND. So SEND is like the library and SEMH is like one row of shelves on the library relating particularly to social, emotional, and mental health needs. Right. And really, you're lumping in with that behaviour because when kids' social, emotional, and mental health needs aren't addressed effectively, then 9 times out of 10, the result is difficult behaviour, challenging behaviour in the classroom.
Okay, so I think I understand what you're talking about. And so the reason I brought up
SEMH is a type of SEND.
Got you. So the reason I brought it up was because there's been seemingly a big rise in children who have extra needs, and also a big rise in behaviour challenges in the classroom. And I've seen some great quotes from you about disrespectful behaviour in the classroom. And one of them was, "Don't take it personally."
Especially when they mean it personally.
Now, why? How are we supposed? Because we say this to parents all the time. We just
Yeah.
say, look, the teenagers don't take it personally. But you've just said, especially when they mean it personally. How does that translate into managing a classroom full of kids when you've got someone who's being swearing at you or being disrespectful?
Well, the first thing is you're a human being, so everyone has a low day. Everyone, in all honesty, I had a hard day on Friday. I ended up raising my voice to my daughter. Did she deserve it? Probably not. We're all human beings.
Yes.
And we shouldn't judge ourselves on this idea of perfection. It's fine to have a standard that you're aiming for, but as a human being, you're led by your emotions. We know from science that you're led by your emotions, firstly and foremost. So, first of all, you've got to have realistic expectations for yourself in the classroom. But then what you've got to think about, and this is true for parents as well, you've got to think about in a classroom, there's 29 other kids in your house. There might be 2 or 3 other kids. And they're actually looking at you and you're role modeling what to do in that situation. They're going to look at what you're doing and they're going to lock it away as a template. We used to have this poster on the wall at I used to work at a pupil referral unit teaching kids who are permanently excluded. And there was a poster up on the wall that really stuck with me. And it was, I can't remember who it was from, but it was, don't worry that your kids are listening to everything that you say. Worry that they're watching every little thing that you do.
I like that.
It's scary, but it's true. And also, if one of your own kids or, whether it's a student or your own child, if they're getting upset, then actually what you've got to, I think what I learned was in those moments, it's not about trying to control what they do. You've got someone who's out of control of their emotions. And actually, my job is to try and manage this situation out. They're out of control of their emotions, or there's something going on and they're overwhelmed. And my job now is there's like a plane, and my job is to land that plane, that emotional plane, successfully. I'm like at the radio tower. I'm not in control of the plane, but I'm at the radio tower. I'm trying to talk that plane down with a very frustrated, irrational pilot at that moment. And when you see your role as that, actually, it takes away the conflict. I've met a lot of teachers, and what's interesting about being a teacher is most of the kids, most of the time, just do what you ask them to, right? It's like they're just programmed to do that. In evolutionary terms, they're just programmed to follow instructions. And even kids who have difficulty with their emotions, and teachers say, they never do what they're told to do. You do a time of motion, and 98% of the time, they're just doing what they're told to do. You notice the 2% when they don't. But actually, 98% of the time they do. So you can walk into a room and... we've got the video here, but I'll kind of explain what I'm doing for people listening on audio. You can walk into a room with 300 kids in an assembly hall, and you can stand in front of them, and you can just, with your hands, put them in front of you and just raise them up to your face like that, and 300 kids will stand up. It's like Yoda lifting the X-Wing out of the, in The Empire Strikes Back, out of the lake. And that gives you this full sense of you control kids. And you don't. You just set up a set of circumstances and a set of environments, and you give them a set of values where they're more likely to do the right thing than the wrong thing. And then those teachers really struggle because they feel like they control the kids. That's how it feels. But actually, when they meet a child who doesn't do that, who doesn't conform 100% of the time, actually that makes them question their professional capacity. As a teacher, and they find that really threatening. And actually talking to them and making that mindset shift from, okay, your job's not to control this child. Your job is just to help them manage those out of control emotions for the next 5 or 6 minutes. That kind of takes the onus off you, and it takes you into a slightly different role.
I love that. And I think that's something that we parents can completely get on board with as well. I mean, it's the same at home, right? We don't. Yeah. And actually, one of the things that some of our parents, all of us actually, we all struggle with is, how do I get my kid to do X? Well, in many ways, if you set up an environment where it was just a kind of expected situation, then 9 times out of 10, they probably will do it unless they feel that it's a power battle.
Yeah. And then the worst thing you can do is engage in a power battle. That's one of the things we say to teachers, actually. I call it a dead-end confrontation, where you're saying yes and the child is saying no. And usually, if there's an audience, that makes it harder for people to be kind of what's the word, more flexible, more pliable, because no one wants to lose face.
Yes.
What people will tell you in a face-to-face
Interesting.
conversation, one-to-one, the minute there's another person in the room, you've got an audience, and then people take entrenched positions. So it's about, you're absolutely right, spotting, being drawn into a power battle, and you can feel the sand sort of shifting underneath your feet because you can tell them to do it, but actually they've got a choice. They might do it.
They've got a choice.
They might not. And
so once that child has lost control of their feelings, their emotions, how would you get them to how would you guide that plane back down onto the ground?
So there's lots of research on this, and if you look at it, different researchers have kind of come out at the same conclusion. I'm a parent as well, so my kids are teenagers. So
welcome to the club.
I love the research by John Gottman. I think his research is the most accessible at this. I'm being an emotion coaching parent, which is a simple sort of 3 or 4 step process for shifting into that role of manager rather than confrontation. And the steps are essentially recognize actually that this isn't a power battle. This is your child has lost control of their emotions for whatever reason. And it's your opportunity. It's a teaching moment, right? It's an opportunity to role model and teach how to succeed in this situation. And we live in a world, we see this with adults as well. Any tiny bump in the road, any tiny problem, and it's exploded into this massive thing. Like on social media, everyone's shouting at each other. You're going to shops, you see adults just, this culture of no one's listening, everyone's shouting over tiny, tiny things. So the first thing we do is we kind of recognize as the adult, right? Let's not slip into that confrontation. Let's move into an emotion coaching moment, and then extend empathy. So there's also a guy called Dan Siegel who's done work on this in terms of neurobiology of kids. And the first place we've got to start is with connection. And there's another saying in teaching, and I can't attribute it. It's connection before correction, right? So you spend a few moments saying, look, I think you're really frustrated about having to do the dishwasher because you've got loads of homework and it feels unfair and blah. And you just hang around in that moment of empathy and connection for a minute. You're showing that you understand the way they feel. You might not agree with what they've done, but you're showing you understand their emotions, and you're hanging around in those emotions for longer than you normally would. And you might say, look, I remember a time when my mum asked me to do X, Y, and Z. You just sort of sit there in that connection for a while. And you sort of, instead of coming head on, what you're doing is sort of drawing yourself alongside them. If you imagine 2 horses and one horse is out of control, for the one rider to take control of both horses, actually he's got to come alongside so he can kind of straddle both horses. Probably don't do that in real life. It's probably too dreadful advice. I've never been on a horse in my life. But you can kind of imagine you've got to come alongside someone. And then the next step is setting a boundary. It's like, I understand that your sister, has just deleted all your work, but it's not okay to hit her. And you're setting a boundary there. And I often like to use the phrase, like, what we've done is, like, in our family, we don't talk to each other like that, because they will see, especially as they're teenagers and they're having experience of other people's families and other people's environments. Kids, when they're young, they just assume that everyone is like you. Every family is the same. And they're getting an idea of, well, he's allowed to go out and do X, Y, and Z till 2 a.m. in the morning. So actually saying, look, in our family, these are our values, and that's not okay. And other families will have other values, and that's their choice. But I've got these values because I love and care about you, and I want you to be the best person you can be. And then the beautiful thing is you switch into problem solving, which is a much less confrontational conversation to have. It's like, look, what's gone wrong here, and how can we fix it? Give me 2 or 3 ideas about how we move this forward. And I've just found having that kind of script, empathy, boundary, problem solve, takes all of the pressure and all of the it depersonalizes it.
Yes. And also, eventually what you're doing, it sounds like eventually what you're doing is, once you've calmed them and you've made them realize that it's not you against them, you're actually next to them, then they can start switching their thinking brain back on again. Because when you engage them and say, so like, how can we solve this? What's the best way forward? They then have to try and think. And that's the hardest thing often to get people to do when they're upset.
And they're in that situation because they didn't have the problem solving skills to manage it successfully the first time. And it's called coaching, motion coaching, because if you think of any other form of coaching, imagine you're learning to run, sprint, or something. You wouldn't turn up at coaching for running and have one half an hour session with the coach, and then he's like, "Oh, well, you're done. You can run now." Coaching involves bursts of input repetitively over time, developing and improving skills. And so if you tried emotion coaching once and it didn't work, well, actually what you've got to commit to is time after time after time. And eventually what happens is you're giving them the skills. So then down the line, when they're in that situation, they can cope with it. And when you look at kids, when you look at the work that Gottman did on emotion coaching kids, when you look at their long-term progression, those kids, it's not that they never get frustrated or angry or sad, but they spend less time in those emotions than other kids, and they tend to have they tend to be able to think in the long term. They tend to be able to think ahead and find ways forward, and tend to, in terms of sort of academically and socially, tend to do better in life. They tend to be sort of steadier, which is obviously good in terms of work and relationships and all sorts.
Yes, because this sort of resonates in so many ways with what we've talked about many times on this podcast, and this whole thing with my kids, where I say, "Have you got stuck?" You know, whatever they're doing, I'll just say, "Are you stuck at the moment?" Because quite often they get trapped in a place and they can't move forward. And I think that so often with our teenagers, and we as adults will look at our kids and go, "Well, I told you, you know how to do this," or, you know, why haven't you got this yet? Or they'll come to me and they'll say, "Oh, I really struggle with making small talk conversation. You know, am I broken? Have I got some special need?" And I just go, "No, everyone struggles with that. This is normal." And it's a skill, and we have to practice it over and over again in order to get to the point where we feel comfortable, and it's kind of automatic.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a life skill that you develop over time. And if it was easy, everyone would be doing it. But look around on TV, look around on social media, look around in the world. How many people are on hair triggers over tiny, tiny things?
You know, we all struggle. Okay, so we don't have to judge each other. We just go, "Yeah, that's a skill that they haven't conquered yet."
And I think there's a lot of power when they talk about their friends, and maybe their friends have done something, and then you say, "Well, you know, how do you think that worked out for them? How, you know, what would you have done in that situation? What would you have done differently? What do you think they, you know?" It's interesting because then you're picking it out, but then you're bringing it back to a values-based conversation. And I think as a parent of a teen, when the kids are younger, basically you direct them to do things. If you've got an 18-year-old drinking bleach, basically you pull them away from the bleach. So don't have the bleach. If they can't understand, you lock the bleach away, or you physically move them away. But you move away from direction to, this is my view. I completely
agree. No, absolutely.
Helping them develop a set of morals and values by which to judge situations they're in. And I think if we get it right, you can have conversations like you were in a situation, someone said X, Y, or Z, or you said X, Y, and Z. How did that feel? Did that feel right? Did that feel wrong?
Yes, dip into your value tank and see
you can't give them a set of procedures for navigating the world, because it would be 1,600 pages long and it would be incomplete. They need to be able to, and we talk about this with teachers as well. You need like a framework to help you assess what's happening around you and make good decisions about what to do next. In school, we say to teachers, look, if your school has got a value of respect, and most schools do, then actually, when you were yelling at that child, were you embodying that value of respect? Were you, you know, it was like,
like that.
So
no,
so I think values are important.
Yes, and coming on to the classroom situation, I saw that you were talking about using why in the classroom and addressing challenging behaviour by repeating the question why until you've got to an answer. Can you talk a bit more about, I mean, this is what we've been talking about a lot on our podcast, which is being curious rather than judgmental, because it's so easy for us to jump to, "Oh, I see what's going on there," when we don't really have any information.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to put some nuance in that. I am a big fan of doing simple things well first. So I'm assuming if you've got a child with behavior issues in the classroom, I'm going to go in and assume, or I'm going to go and make sure that the adults in the room have done the basics. They're consistent. They say what they mean. Yeah, all of that kind of thing. They're not saying we're going to manage your behaviour one way, and then on Tuesday it's different, on Wednesday it's different. So the child never knows. So you've got to get the basics in place first, because without the basics, it's not going anywhere. So, so assuming those basics are in place, the idea of the whys is it's the Toyota 5 whys, and it came from Toyota. I think it was in the 1920s or 30s, and they developed this way of thinking about problems they were having in their manufacturing plants, which was essentially, if I give a Toyota example, if I give a car example, and then I give a child example to try and show how one translates to the next. So imagine they're having problems with windscreens being cracked, and they look at their floor and they say, well, that person fitting the windscreen is rubbish. They're not doing their job properly. Let's sack them. And then next week, they're still having windscreens cracked. They haven't really solved the problem. So what they started doing was they said, we're going to ask why 5 times until we reach the solution. So the windscreens are being cracked on the assembly line. Why is that happening? Well, it's happening because this guy keeps dropping the windscreens. Okay, so why is he dropping the windscreens? Well, he's got the wrong gloves or something. Okay, so why has he got the wrong gloves? Well, because procurement are having their meeting with the foreman every other week to discuss what's working and not working on the site. And if you ask 5 whys, you kind of get somewhere. And if you think about that procurement meeting, there might be lots of downstream problems that are happening because that meeting isn't being effective. And solving the problem of that meeting not happening might then actually solve lots of other things as well. And when you look at kids in school or kids at home, if you ask yourself, I'll give a classroom example. A child keeps shouting out a whole class time and monopolizing the teacher's attention so other kids don't get a look in, which is something the other kids finds frustrating. You might say, okay, I could just try punishments and things like that. And if that doesn't work, I'd say punishments, positive and negative, doing all those kind of things. And if, like things like reward charts and looking at all those basic kind of things. But if the basics don't work, then we've got to ask, well, why? Why is the child shouting out? Well, maybe they don't understand that they need to share their time with a teacher. Why don't they understand they need to share their time with a teacher? And then there are a million different ways you can go from there. Maybe they have difficulties in generally socially. Why have they got that? Well, maybe they have autistic traits, or maybe there were issues around the way that child interacts at home. Maybe there's neglect in them. There are all sorts of reasons why children might not develop social competences. But it's only by going why that you end up at something that's meaningful. It's like a set of dominoes. And if you can get to the first domino in the sequence, you're much more likely to be effective. If you're looking at the last domino in the sequence, what you're trying to do is manage the problem as an adult. If my child keeps breaking curfew, if curfew's 10 o'clock and they keep coming back at 11 o'clock, well, one way of making sure they don't break curfew is to put deadlocks in every door at the house and seal them at 4. That will solve the problem. You created a prison, but it will solve the problem. But actually, the minute the door opens, the child's out. So by asking why are they coming back late? Well, what is it that's happening when they're out? What is it about their friends? Do their friends have a slightly later curfew? Can we have flexibility? Every situation is different. But actually, it's about finding solutions that enable the child to succeed and flourish for themselves, rather than us as the adult trying to helicopter and manage it like that.
And then you don't have to keep going over the same thing at times, and then the next classroom they do the same thing, and the next, you've actually managed to address a real issue, which is the skill they need, and then everybody's much happier. Great, I love that. What about? I saw that you said there's a myth that high behaviour standards and trauma-informed practice are incompatible. Can you talk a bit more about why that's a myth?
Yeah. So for people that are new to the term, trauma-informed practice is essentially what I've just been talking about, thinking really deeply about why kids are behaving or acting in a certain way in any element of their life, rather than just going with a kind of like if they break the rule, this is what happens. If they follow the rule, kind of more like a mechanistic, a behaviorist approach. So it's just really digging deep into the underlying causes. And often what you find is, let's take the example of kids who have, let's say kids have sensory needs. When you dig into it, they're finding it hard to cope in a busy classroom because there's lots of noise, lots of displays, lots of things going on, and they just find that sensory environment really difficult. You say, well, that's a physical thing about them. That's not going to change. There's not a tablet you can give them. There's not something you can do to kind of train them out of that. But one approach that might be successful, they've got social anxiety. That's another thing. So if we expose them to the busy, sensory, socially complex classroom, what's going to happen is they're going to increase their stress and anxiety levels. And at some point, they're not going to be able to restrain that. They're not going to be able to cope, and you're going to get an explosion or a meltdown, or they're going to run away, or there's going to be some sort of emotional issue that needs to be dealt with, which is not good for them, not good for the teacher, not good for the other students, because that's a highly intense situation. So one adaptation might be that they can just go, there's a table just outside the room, and after they've been inside the busy social environment, busy sensory environment, after about 15 minutes, they can pop out and they can have just 5 minutes reading a book or something, just to reduce those stress levels.
Yes.
So when they return to the room, they can succeed. And I think when you look at those kind of adaptations, sometimes there's a temptation from some teachers to say, well, that kid's getting rewarded, they're doing no work, they should be in the classroom. And then they start talking about it being low standards. If you've got a child who needs a movement break, what does that look like in the classroom? Well, actually, if you implement movement breaks effectively in the classroom, they shouldn't be disturbing to the other children. If you do them badly, it can look like chaos. It can look like a child running around the classroom and throwing everyone off task. If you've got a child who has sensory needs, they're putting in place measures to meet and support to meet those needs can either be discreet or it can be very disruptive. Or if it's done badly, it can have no impact, and then you see behavior. So that's the tension there. And that can look like low standards if it's done in a low quality, badly planned,
right.
Also cheap way. Inclusion is expensive. Let's just put that to bed. Inclusion done well is generally expensive. So when things are done in a bad way, actually, it looks like we're just tolerating any behavior. There's chaos in the classroom. That, in my opinion, isn't about inclusion, and it's not about trauma-informed practice. That's just about lots of things done badly.
Yes, right. Yeah.
And a good trauma-informed classroom should look like a focused, productive classroom. Focused and quiet is not necessarily... It's not about whether the room is quiet. That's going to depend on the task. If you've got lots of kids doing a spelling test, that needs to be quiet. If it's a piece of teamwork where you've got a group of 3 or 4 children working on a piece of art together or a piece of design, talk is appropriate. But how much talk? So it's complicated. Does that make sense? Does that kind of
It does make sense. And it just, to me, when I'm listening to all of the things that teachers have to do, it sounds like we're expecting a huge amount from teachers, because these are human beings who may have teenagers at home and are having to come into work and deal with quite stressful situations, or having to anticipate how to manage an entire classroom with structures. So presumably it's the setting up of the structures and being very clear about what the procedures are, so that then you don't have to keep reinventing the wheel every day.
Yeah. Expectations and consistency are massive. And when you're a teacher, you also have to take like a bird's eye 30,000 foot view, which is in general, how do I run this class? What are the routines? What are the expectations? And then there's kind of like the zoomed down view for individual students, which is, okay, those are my general principles, but now how am I going to make reasonable, not any adaptation, but a reasonable adaptation to make this successful?
Now, I want to talk about, because obviously the people who are listening to this podcast are predominantly parents of teenagers or tweens or grandparents. And I'm fascinated by what you would say to them about how they can be supportive of teachers and an education system. We have had an episode talking about how to have conversations with teachers and why it continues to be important even into the teen years, and that you are a team. But are there, if you had a parent's ear, what would you be saying to them about what's going on in schools and how we can actually set our kids up to succeed and support the teachers?
Well, I think the tone you've got to strike is positive. It is about how can we work together to help my son or daughter. What you have to appreciate is schools are generally full of people that they didn't come into teaching for the money. They generally came into teaching because they wanted to make a difference and they like young people and they want to support them. And some of them got jaded along the way, but deep down, That is why they turn up to work every day. But they've been badly served. You're talking about people who don't necessarily have the training or the knowledge to understand about the different forms of autism and ADHD or there are so many different conditions, and you've got your child with their one condition and that's all you have to know about. But a teacher is kind of like more like a in a sense like a GP. They have to know about lots of things, but they aren't given the training, the consistent support to know about those things. It's almost like a GP that's been given a year of training. And so, well, you know about a cold, and you know about ankle, you know about tonsillitis, you're good to be a GP. We'd never do that. Children are presenting ever more complex needs, and it might be that the adult that you're talking to, they don't know what they don't know. And rightly or wrongly, there might be a job of education on your part. And I like the phrase, right? That situation might not be your fault, but actually it might be your responsibility to change, because without that, nothing's going to improve. And it's about the tone of the dialogue. When it's your child, and I know as an adult, as a parent, when it's your child, it's intensely personal and it's much more emotional. Whereas when you're a teacher, it's professional. You're just trying to meet the needs of different children who aren't yours, and you care, but you care in a different way. You don't have that love. You don't have that depth of love for the child that as a parent that you have for a child that's yours. So it's actually sometimes parents go in and teachers can feel ambushed, and that's down to a lack of communication between home and school, and often schools to blame here. Often schools don't bring things up until it's too late. They let things run, and then the parent feels overwhelmed, or a parent is storing up issues. And as you know, in any aspect of your life, when you store things up, when you actually have a conversation, it could be like, with your partner, if your partner's doing something that's been annoying you, if you store it up, actually, when you have that conversation, it tends to be quite an emotional conversation. So you've got to kind of rein those emotions back, however you feel on the inside, because without that, as a teacher who's been on the opposite side, I thought everything was fine, perhaps with a student. I can think of one student, perhaps that student maybe had autism and they were masking really, really well in school. So it doesn't look like there's any issues, but when they go home, they're having these meltdowns at the end of the day because they've not been able to, they've been struggling to cope, and those emotions have got to go somewhere. They go home and they're having a terrible time. And I can think of like a mom who has perhaps turned up at the classroom door. I have no clue that this is happening at home. But that mom has been frustrated for 2, 3, 4 months. And then she comes in and then she kind of like offloads. And then as an adult, I feel ambushed because I wasn't expecting to have that conversation out of nowhere. And then that puts you on the back foot, or it makes you defensive, and it makes you locked down as the adult because you're thinking, oh, dear, what the hell?
Right. Yes.
You feel attacked. So actually what we need is, to bring it back to emotion coaching, problem-solving conversations. And it's like, how do we fix this problem in kind of like an adult way? Well, I am listening to you. You are listening to me. So yes, how do we connect? I think in a world where everyone's shouting at each other, listening is a superpower.
I agree. Yes.
And it is about being persistent, because there are so many needs out there right now. Unless you're persistent, you may get overlooked, but you can do that in a firm but polite way.
Yeah. And I think write everything down.
Yeah.
That's the one tip I have. And the conflict resolution episode that we did, where we're talking about like, how do you identify what the problem really is, which comes down to asking questions, listening. And I do think that writing things down and having a structure for how things will proceed can make a massive difference, because everybody's under a lot of pressure. And if you walk away having had a conversation and you don't have a plan going forward and you don't have agreed measures, then it's going to be difficult to then reinforce anything.
Yeah. And I think I massively echo that. I think I have a post-it note with some bullet points on it. And we say that when I recommend that when parents go to the doctors, if they're worried about their child, I think that they might need a diagnosis. You have those conversations and they can spiral off. But when you do those, what I would do is I would focus the conversation on the needs that you believe your child has, other than a list of accusations.
Yes.
Because if you see the person in front of you getting defensive or nervous or even angry, you've provoked an emotional reaction in them, and now they're not able to engage in that conversation.
Fascinating.
Because actually what's happened is their prefrontal lobe is shut down. They're not being able to access their thinking, logical brain in a way that can plan ahead for success. Actually, you put them in a position where they can't actually listen to you or do the things that you want them, them to do.
Right.
So it's hard, but I think it's going in and reining that emotion right back and talking about the need as you perceive it, and then listening.
Yes.
And hopefully the teacher will do the same for you. Hopefully you'll both be listening.
Yeah.
Sometimes if you find it difficult to do that, I've been in situations where a parent has found someone who, like a brother or a sister or, a friend who maybe it's not 100% personal to them, so they can take the sting out. So if they sense that that you're becoming emotional or upset, they can kind of take over the conversation for a little bit and support.
I love that. But I do think that if you're going to go in with another person, perhaps you need to tell the teacher beforehand. Otherwise, they may think, wait, hang on, there are two of you.
I'm thinking of a pre-arranged meeting here. I'm thinking of pre-arranged meeting.
Yes.
Definitely. Yeah. Don't turn up with a posse of 6 people and a lynching pole. Because the thing to bear in mind about teaching is no one ever, it's incredibly rare anyone comes in at the end of the day and shakes your hand and tells you you're doing a good job. As a teacher, what you deal with is complaints. Even management will rarely say to you, you're doing a good job with that class or doing a good job with those kids. The thing with social media as well is now teachers are reading what people are saying about them in social media, and people generally don't post on social media, Mr. Jones or Mrs. Jones, we're doing a fantastic job with my kid. What you tend to read on social media is this school is rubbish, this teacher says X, Y, Z. And I think that lack of productive dialogue, when you talk to teachers, that's often, it's not just behavior, it's the kind of like, that's driving a lot of what people of why people are leaving. I heard an interview with some doctors who had gone to Australia, had left the NHS, and they were kind of interviewing them about what their new life was like. And they said, well, you get paid a lot more money. And they were like, well, we get paid a bit more money. It's not a lot more money, but a bit more money. But here the profession still kind of like has some respect, and people don't just shout at us like they do in the NHS, and we don't get attacked. And I think that kind of professional dialogue, as well as has gone from education. And I'm not saying teachers should be put on a pedestal and never questioned. That's not it. But actually, there's a way we can talk to each other that helps bring about success for the child, which is ultimately what you want as a parent, and ultimately what they do want as a teacher.
And I love what you're saying, because actually, we always ask for people to review our program, and we get some amazing reviews in, and they just make my day. They make me feel so much better and like, oh, it's worthwhile what I'm doing. And we can be doing that for teachers. If you notice the teacher's done something good, why not a little note? And actually, I saw one teacher saying, you know what, the best present you can give me for Christmas is a handwritten note. Preferably something that you send also to the headmaster telling me how great I am, because that would just make me feel better. And I thought, gosh, that's a really, we're kind of missing the point sometimes, and forgetting just how good it feels when we're doing a job and we're recognized for doing a good job.
Yeah. Even an email,
An email,
Yeah, even an email, because an email as a teacher tends to be an inbox of deadlines and complaints.
Yes.
And an email that stands out is just saying, all it's got to be is, I just really appreciate the way that you've made accommodations for my son, or appreciate the way you listen. It's nothing. It takes 10 seconds of time.
Yes.
If you think about what it does for your relationship with that teacher in a purely transactional sense, and I'm not saying do it because it's transactional, but actually it makes them way more likely to listen to you in the future.
You're so right. This is, we really need to do this. I'm going to go and write some emails.
I heard there's a line that's about 100. I think it's about 100 years old. I think it's from How to Make Friends and Influence People that probably applies here, and it's I'm going to mangle it, but it's something along the lines of, a person convinced against their will is a person of the same opinion still.
Right.
So shouting at people and telling them X, Y, and Z. This is what should happen, actually.
So in other words, what I keep saying, which is that if people don't argue back with you and you shout them down, they're still going to think the same thing.
Yeah.
That's not going to
Absolutely.
change their opinion.
Absolutely.
One last thing before we finish, I wanted to address school avoidance. Now,
It's even moved on from school refusal. School
yes,
avoidance.
yes, and that's it,
Yeah.
because I mentioned school refusal and people said, no, you can't say that. That's very offensive. And so we do have to tread lightly on this. But, that is at a really record highs as well. What are your thoughts about, what's causing it and whether there are things we can be doing as parents? Because I saw a headmaster saying, I thought people were being unreasonable until my daughter started avoiding school. And it's completely put me back in my box. And I don't know how to cope with it. So, it's a very, very difficult issue. It's really, really upsetting for everybody involved. What are your thoughts about it and what we can be doing, A, to stop it from happening, and B, to help?
Okay. So truancy is different from, it tends to be called EBSA, emotionally based school avoidance. Okay, I'll just call it school avoidance for short. Truancy is where kids are just making an active decision. They don't want to go into school, or they're bunking off, or they're hiding, in the toilet or something. Sometimes, and we've got to be careful here not to over medicalize things. Sometimes teenagers just do dumb stuff, right?
True.
We all just make dumb decisions in life sometimes, and it's wrong just to over medicalize that and say there must be all sorts of reasons behind it. So sometimes some kids will just do some dumb stuff. That's part of being a teenager and growing up. Let's not. But for children who have that persistent fear or anxiety about school, there are lots of other things going on. If it helps, I've got like a simple framework that actually nails most of the reasons why kids actually have difficulty getting into school. And when you tackle those, I'm not saying it doesn't cover 100% of the reason why kids don't get into school, because there are obviously hundreds of reasons, but the key things to look at, the aspects to look at. And I call it the RAIDed framework. So R stands for relationships. And it could be there's a relationship that's broken down, say, with certain adults in school. Perhaps there are certain teachers. And if you find that there's a pattern to their resistance to going into school, maybe it's a Monday and a Tuesday and a Thursday, it might be that they're meeting certain teachers, or there's a relationship that doesn't feel right there, and they don't know how to put it, they don't know how to fix it. Or it could be a relationship with another peer. So maybe they're falling out with certain friendship groups, or there's some bullying, or there's some issues around relationships there. So that often fuels school avoidance. And conversely, the way of fixing that actually is to create positive relationships, or fix the relationships that are broken. That's fairly easy. So A is anxiety. And you most commonly find, especially this bulge of need that seems to have come post-COVID, most of those kids have issues around anxiety, not exclusively, but particularly kids who are on the spectrum. School is a busy, noisy, sensorily, socially complex place that lots of children who are autistic find really demanding and difficult and anxiety provoking. And I think what happened during COVID was there's a period where they said, well, look, you don't need to manage those anxieties. You don't need to come into school. You can learn perfectly fine at home. And a lot of those kids did. Not all of them, but a lot of them were doing perfectly well. They were getting perfectly good grades. They were missing a social education. But in terms of the academic side, they were told, well, that's fine. And then they were in school, and then they were out of school. And it's fine not to come in again. And they were getting lots of mixed messages. And I think a lot of them are thinking, well, look, I was learning perfectly successfully before. Why do I need to put myself in this overwhelming environment that I find personally threatening? And there are other reasons people can have anxiety. That's just one example of anxiety. And until you deal with the anxiety, you're going to get that resistance. You're going to get the refusal. You're going to get the avoidance. I is identity. And identity is essentially what does someone like me do in a situation like this? So when kids are younger, they have a strong family identity. But as they get older, they have an identity in terms of their friendship group. What does the group of people I'm hanging around with do in a situation like this? D can be D's direction. The first D is direction. So it's easy to think, and this one probably applies more to teachers, but we can assume they don't want to go to school. So the direction is, I want to be out of school because I find school threatening or upsetting or difficult in some way. But sometimes children, school's fine. They don't have a problem with school, but they're worried about something happening in the home.
Oh.
So perhaps someone's ill, or there's been a bereavement and they've got this irrational fear that someone else will die. Maybe mom and dad are arguing all the time and they're worried that they're going to separate or there's going to be a divorce. As a teacher, we have to deal with things like neglect and DV and intimate partner violence. So actually, school might be fine. So you have to think about the direction of travel, either being pulled towards home or pushed away from school. E is environment. So again, looking at things like the sensory environment, do they find it overwhelming? Is it overstimulating? Is it too much? Is it too difficult? And unless we put in place accommodations for those sensory needs, then nothing is going to change. Those sensory needs aren't going to change overnight. Sensory needs do shift over time. But, accommodations need to be met, because if you're walking into an environment where, let's say you're oversensitive to sound, which is the classic one, if you find it physically painful to be in a classroom because it's so noisy or the corridors are so noisy and it's hurting your ears and it's causing you physical discomfort, then obviously you're not going to want to be there. So we've got relationships, we've got anxiety, we've got identity, we've got direction, we've got environment, and we've got the final D. And the final D is dislocation. So do they feel for some reason dislocated from the school community? Do they feel excluded for some reason? Do they feel unwelcome? Has something gone wrong about the way the school has, well, it doesn't mean, not necessarily the way the school has welcomed the child into the school, but often they can just feel like, I don't belong here. I don't feel welcome here.
Presumably some of that can be cultural, or it can be to do with your family setup, that, if you've come from a family that have never really studied and never valued school, then it can be very difficult to see a great value in the school system.
Yeah, and if you look at, interestingly, statistically, the kids that are doing worst in the system, interestingly, but a statistics perspective, are working class white boys and working class black boys. And I certainly, we work with a lot of families and we see a lot of things in schools. So what I'm not saying is not statistically accurate, but we work with a lot of schools and a lot of families. And there is an increasing number of people who, we used to value education and we used to see it as a way of escaping from poverty. And so we place great stock and great value in sending our kids to school. But for those groups, maybe education doesn't hold that anymore. And
why do you think that is?
The value of it has been lost. And I'm not saying all white working class families like this. I'm not saying all white working class black families like this. But there's certainly significant groups of people that just don't see the point in sending their kids to school. And of course, that becomes a culture. And it's like, well, that's not for you. You're not going to go to uni. You're not going to do an apprenticeship. You're going to whatever. And that's a bigger societal problem.
Yeah. If people want to find you, I'll put a link in the podcast notes, and there'll be a link on my website to all the information. Where would they find you?
Okay, so two key places. We've got a podcast called School Behaviour Secrets. It's available wherever you listen to podcasts. It's predominantly aimed at teachers and school leaders, but there's loads of information there as a parent.
Great tips.
Although what we talk about is classroom-based, it doesn't take a massive amount of common sense to translate it into a home-based environment. So School Behaviour Secrets, and we've also got a website called beaconschoolsupport.co.uk, where we've got tons of free downloads. Again, they're all got a slight, they're all slanted towards teachers, but actually, if you've got half an ounce of common sense, you'll be able to translate anything on the website to your own children. Loads of free downloads about understanding why children do the things they do, which is our big thing. We want to understand why children are having difficulties, how they need support. And what we're big on as well is giving you practical strategies, practical things you can take away to go and do with your kids to help them succeed and flourish.
That was Simon Currigan, who has a podcast called School Behaviour Secrets. If you enjoyed this podcast, why not let other people know? You can put us on social media, share with friends and people from your school environment. Why not give us a review? That would be amazing. And if you want to actually contribute to any discussion that we've been having, or give me some extra tips that I can use on the podcast, then you can reach me at teenagersuntangled@gmail.com, or just come to the website, which is www.teenagersuntangled.com. That's it for now. Bye-bye.